This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. In this first of two special editions, we'll be looking back at some of the highlights of our agendas of 2019. On our very first episode of The Agenda, we were joined by China's ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming. The veteran diplomat came in to talk about trade between China and the UK and its importance leading up to a possible Brexit. It was a wide-ranging interview, and he wasn't fazed at all when I asked him about the demonstrations on the streets of Hong Kong. When you see the pictures in Hong Kong, that's not peaceful. How damaging are those pictures when they go around the world to China's reputation?
I don't think it has a damage to China's reputation. I think the more damage should be to some Western countries who I believe are behind this violence, riotous activities. I think China has gained a lot of credit from one country, two system, the success of one country, two system. I think, for instance, in my engagement with British politicians, I think some of them still fail to realize Hong Kong now is part of China. They still treat Hong Kong as part of UK or still under British colonial rule. For instance, some people would like to give all the citizenship to the Hong Kong, MBO, and I think that shows their ignorance of the development in Hong Kong.
Does Beijing still believe in one country, two systems?
Yes, very much so. I think on the eve of our National Day, at the Great Hall of People, at the reception marking the 70th anniversary, President Xi reaffirmed one country, two systems for Hong Kong, and Hong Kong people administering Hong Kong affairs, and Hong Kong will continue to enjoy high degree of autonomy. But important thing, people, in this country, some people focus on two systems only. They forget one country, two systems is a whole concept, and one country is the foundation of a two system.
And then we moved on from one country, two systems to talk about trade between China and the UK and what the trading relationship might be like post-Brexit. What is the view from Beijing? How are they watching this incredible row develop? And do they prefer Britain to be in the European Union or out?
We certainly follow Brexit very closely because UK is a very important, not only business partner to China, but also our two countries have a lot of collaboration cross-border, politically, economically, culturally, and we are also two very important permanent members of the UN Security Council. We have a broad agenda internationally. So we would like to see things be resolved smoothly, satisfactorily to both sides, to EU. Both UK and the EU are two important partners to China. So we wish you the best of luck. But we believe this is very much up to UK and EU.
I understand that, but is it easier for China to deal with the UK inside Europe? Because the UK is a bit of a conduit into Europe, isn't it? Or do you prefer to deal with Europe and Britain separately? What would be most advantageous to Britain?
It's very hard for us to make a choice. We only will try to make the best of what we can have. So I think there's both advantages for UK in EU and also both advantages for UK out of EU. So we have to make the best of what we can have. But UK is now building what they call it global Britain, And I think that will provide more opportunities for collaboration between China and UK.
Liu Xiaoming. For our next show, we took the agenda on the road, this time to Geneva. It was for an exclusive interview with the head of the UN Refugee Agency, Filippo Grandi. There are more than 70 million forcibly displaced people in the world, and I began by asking Mr. Grandi what the difference was between a refugee and a migrant.
Refugees are people fleeing from war, violence, persecution, people that cannot be sent back to their countries because they risk their lives, essentially. Migrants are people that move for sometimes very compelling reason. Poverty, climate change these days is also having an impact. Sometimes the two overlap, of course, but it's different causes and different situations. So I think that there is an obligation to support migrants too, but there is a different constraint in terms of going back to their homes or not. This is a fundamental issue. That's why we always, we use a very technical term, refoulement, which means sending back. It's a French term that means pushing back. And non-refoulement, non-pushing back, is one of the key international refugee protection principles, part of whom are refugees. So we also need to look at it not only as a isolated problem, but as a phenomenon which is inscribed in this bigger phenomenon of human mobility, which today is one of the big global challenges.
Do you believe in borders? Because Mr. Guterres doesn't and the European Union doesn't.
Well, I can't speak for others, including for the Secretary General, but whether I believe in borders or not is immaterial, in fact, because borders exist and are enforced in most of the cases.
Rightly or wrongly?
There are attempts at overcoming borders, like the European Union is one of them. There are attempts at strengthening borders, are building walls. I would certainly be against that. I think that since borders exist, states exist, nation states exist, I think that what we need to make sure is that those borders are well managed, and in that good management, the principles, for example, applying to refugees, i.e. that they should be allowed to cross border if they're fleeing for their life, that those principles are respected as part of the good management of borders.
What about the refugees arriving in Greece at the moment? Last month, 7,000, most of them from Syria and Afghanistan, arrived in the Greek islands. 600 in one day. Greece can't cope. The people running the camps in Greece can't cope. The European Union can't cope. Why has there been such a failure over the refugees coming across the Mediterranean? Well, what's your explanation?
For a variety of reasons. People are always asking me to provide a simple answer to this very complicated question. There is no simple answer. Sorry, I apologize for that. So I have to give you 2 or 3 points. One is that, and that's the most important, there is insufficient action to address the causes why these people are moving. And that is a very wide range of issues. There is insufficient peacemaking in the world. That's why wars continue forever or are never really resolved, like we see in some parts of Africa, for example. Then there is very unstrategic use of development assistance to address inequality, poverty, the consequences of climate change. Let's hope that all this debate on climate, for example, will help channel more strategically resources in that area. Because these are important things. Because if you can address those root causes, you will automatically diminish the number of people moving on. Then, still, people will continue to move on, and also addressing the causes will take time. And in that, I think that the failure of Europe, there's been several areas of failure, I think, but if there's one that stands out, in my opinion, is the failure to work together, not even as a continent, but as a union that already exists. That's been a failure. Even when things became so bad that Europe had to resort to this famous reallocation of people from Greece and Italy to other countries, that was a pretty straightforward program. It concerned 160,000 people, very manageable in a continent of 500 million people. That did not succeed. A small percentage of those people were moved from one country to the other. And that came out of the inability of Europe to work together, but even more importantly, on the fact that we allowed so much space for the political manipulation of these flows, that everybody, even moderate governments, became very hesitant to take action and receive those refugees.
Filippo Grandi talking about what must be one of the hardest jobs in the world. Now, you can't avoid hearing about it just about anywhere in Europe. The dreaded B word, yes, Brexit. For the last 3.5 years, many acres of column inches in newspapers around the world and hours of broadcast media have been devoted to the subject. It is a subject that, quite frankly, has driven people to distraction over what is still almost a never-ending saga. We couldn't and didn't want to avoid the subject, but we wanted on the agenda to try and take a slightly different tack from other news organisations. And we devoted 2 shows to the subject. The first one wondered whether the City of London's financial hub could survive Brexit. And the second show, well, we speculated on the European Union being able to survive the UK Brexiting. The programme began with some facts about the unique City of London, and then I spoke to the city's policy chief, in effect its own Prime Minister, Catherine McGuinness, about the city's readiness for the UK leaving the EU.
Well, so much more happens here than just the EU-facing business. I mean, of course, we have to admit that Brexit is taking up a great deal of time, a great deal of the oxygen in the room which we ought to be devoting to some of the big issues of the day, particularly for government. But what I'd say is that the private sector is still absolutely thriving, absolutely motoring ahead, looking at these other issues as well.
And how can you be sure that you will continue to attract future investment into the city?
Well, so much happens here, as I say, besides the EU-facing business. We are, for example, the largest hub for RMB trading outside Greater China. We are a centre for infrastructure financing the world over. This is the place that the world comes where it wants to be connected with international capital, and that won't change. Of course, some of the business will shift to our EU partners. There will be a change in some of the pattern of work, but business is always changing and developing. We didn't see that great strength in fintech a decade ago that we see now. So the business world is always moving, and there is such a rich and deep system here, and so many services here that people wish to draw on, that actually I am confident for the longer term. Concerned about the short term and the uncertainty which continues, but for the longer term, London's fundamentals, the UK's fundamentals for financial services are very strong.
So a very positive view about the future of the City of London. We then went to talk to Sir Simon Jenkins. He's the author of A Short History of London, and he was just as optimistic the City of London will survive Brexit. We don't know what type of Brexit it'll be, but can you estimate the effect of Brexit on the city?
I think it's very unlikely that that the UK will leave the European Economic Area. I just think it'll stay within some sort of customs union, it'll stay within some sort of single market. And for that reason, I don't think Brexit's going to dramatically affect the status of London or its power or wealth. It is already affecting it, there's no doubt about that. I think that there will be some change. Banks will move some of their staff out of London. A lot of activities will move onto the continent, so manufacturing activities and so on. So there will be a damage done to Britain as a result of Brexit. I'm sure of that, whatever form of Brexit there may be. But London is overwhelmingly the most important city in Europe. It dominates foreign exchange, it dominates the currency trading and so on. It's inconceivable that London will lose that preeminence. It's culturally the most important city in Europe. It's very important. It is the English language is spoken in London. The English language is the language of international trade and commerce now. The links between London and New York are so close, irrespective of the UK's membership of the EU. So I just think London will not suffer that much from Brexit. The rest of England may, but I don't think London will.
You're watching the Best of the Agenda 2019, and coming up later in this programme, we'll be speaking to the Guardian cartoonist Steve Bell about what it's like to try and illustrate the sadder and the funnier sides of the Brexit saga.
There's a kind of explosive element to humour that I love. It's when something, it's an idea is so stupid, it just makes you laugh out loud. And Brexit's been full of that. It's been full of such stupid situations.
Plus, we'll be looking back at a show that was out of this world, quite literally, when we spoke to one of the world's first ever space tourists.
About the age of 13, when one of the NASA doctors told me that because I needed glasses, I was not eligible to be a NASA astronaut, I devoted myself to finding a private way to get myself into space.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda. Welcome back to this special edition of The Agenda. We decided to take a second look at Brexit, so we went to Brussels to meet members of the European Parliament and to ask them, was the EU strong enough to cope with the loss of one of its members, a member state with one of the largest economies in the world? I asked the father of the house, Bill Newton-Dunn, whether there were fissures now among the remaining 27 members of the bloc after Britain leaves.
There is a central core of the member states who say we want to build a federal Europe, a United States of Europe. And the USA took a couple of hundred years to get where it is today. So it will take time for whether the federal drive, France, Italy, Germany, the three Benelux countries, the original six, succeed in that drive. We just don't know. It's part of the exciting project of we're creating the future.
And emotionally, how do you feel as a committed European, a British European?
I feel partly, as you said, this is my 7th term, but I clearly have failed, even in my own region, to persuade the public that being in Europe is a good idea. The country is enormously divided, so distress, disappointment, but actually full of hope, because the British Liberal Democrats say we're going to cancel Brexit if we win power at the next general election. We're staying.
And there'll be more about elections in part 2 of the Best of the Agenda. But for this show, we couldn't resist talking to one of the country's leading cartoonists about the wonders of Brexit, at least from a cartoonist point of view.
It's been going on for years and it's been tedious right from the start. That's actually not a bad thing in cartooning. Sometimes if you've got a boring subject, you can liven it up. But this one's gone on for so long, it is starting to drive everybody mad, including us cartoonists. But there's no sort of shortage of subjects and characters and situations to plunder, as it were. You've had the tragic story of Theresa May, who failed to bring it through, and she was like a sort of walking zombie. And then she fell off her perch completely and was replaced by this new bumptious force of Boris Johnson, who's a ridiculous character in many ways. The idea is to turn politicians into comic characters. And because it's comic, you're using humour. I mean, humour is not always funny, and you're using things like bitter irony, very black, dark irony as well. You're trying to get a point across. You're trying to disturb people's points of view, to get them to see things as I do. But there's a kind of explosive element to humour that I love. It's when something, it's an idea so stupid, it just makes you laugh out loud. And Brexit's been full of that. It's been full of such stupid situations. It's very, very important that we get under that skin and start undoing what they're trying to do, just to show what's really going on. And that's where cartoons come into their own. And a cartoon can do it in a way that no other medium can.
As you might expect, after 2 shows devoted to Brexit, we wanted to try and get as far away from the subject as we could. And so, naturally enough, we went to outer space. Since the Apollo 11 moon landing 50 years ago, humans have made extraordinary progress in space exploration. Unmanned space probes are already pushing the frontiers back, exploring the universe far beyond our solar system, communicating with Earth from over 11 billion miles away. But what is the next major goal for space exploration? And how soon could space tourism become a reality? At the moment, the commercialization of space is very much a billionaire's playground, with Elon Musk's SpaceX, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. Well, they're all fighting for the same headlines. Virgin Galactic, by the way, is all about space tourism, claiming you'll be able to head off on a 90-minute journey in 2020 on its Spaceship Two. But the $250,000 price tag is going to put everyone off, except perhaps the super rich. It will be a good while yet before there's anything like a budget space flight. But it's the installation of satellites in space that could provide the fastest financial returns. The reusable Falcon 9 rocket can get satellites into space at a fraction of the current cost. It's planning 30,000 additional Starlink satellites to build the world's largest low-orbit broadband constellation, beaming super-fast internet across the globe. And all that data, of course, is worth billions of dollars. But the Americans have competition. China's iSpace claims it too can have a reusable rocket in space by 2021. But as the world runs out of much-needed minerals, some think the best place to look for them would be mining asteroids as they pass the Earth. And that raises the question of who owns what in space. Well, the UN Outer Space Treaty of 1967 states no nation can claim sovereignty of any celestial body. The Moon Treaty, signed in 1979, modifies that slightly, suggesting states and companies can benefit, provided there is benefit for all mankind. But what's it really like to go into space? I spoke to one of the world's first ever space tourists, the gaming billionaire Richard Garriott, who visited the International Space Station in 2008.
Well, you know, I think every kid grows up, at least for a period of time, thinking about going to space. But in my case, I had a father who was a NASA astronaut. So in my case, it seemed more plausible. And at about the age of 13, when one of the NASA doctors told me that because I needed glasses, I was not eligible to be a NASA astronaut, I devoted myself to finding a private way to get myself into space. So it took a lot of time, but eventually it worked out. Every aspect of travel in space, or almost every aspect, is phenomenal. You know, even the training is an incredible experience. You know, the day you wake up in the morning, don a spacesuit, go out to a fully fueled rocket that is full of cryogenic fuels with mists, condensation streaming down the sides of it. You get inside and light that up and take a fairly brief 8.5-minute high-speed flight into space, into orbit. Sitting around in space, floating around like Superman 24 hours a day, looking back at the amazing Earth where it it just feels like there's a fire hose of information about the reality in which we live just pouring into your mind as you just look out the window. You know, that's really a life-changing experience. And then, of course, the fiery plunge back into the Earth's atmosphere that is punctuated at the end, in the case of on the Russian Soyuz that I was on, with a hard thump, almost an impact on the surface of the Earth as the finale of your trip. You know, each phase is just an overwhelming experience.
It must have been fantastic. But don't worry, if you don't have the millions needed to get you into space, you can always join the National Space Academy.
When people ask me, what do you mean by space science? I say it's three simple parts. There's looking out there, astronomy, going out there, exploration, and the part that you've been talking about that so many people overlook, the satellites that are looking back here at Earth, because they are giving us the services that are absolutely fundamental to our 21st century way of life. Global telecommunications, increasingly internet satellite provision. And this is the part of the space sector that really makes money. It's $400 billion a year. That's the figure that we're approaching for 2019. It underpins nearly 20% of our global GDP when you look at these services. And as a sector, it's growing. Now, that's a tremendous success story, but we've got a real challenge, because if we want to keep growing the space sector in this way, we need thousands or tens of thousands of new entrants coming in. That's just in the United Kingdom. And so the program that I lead, the National Space Academy program, is a skills development program working with sort of secondary level and university students and their teachers, not only to teach them more about space science, but to enable them to navigate their way successfully into a sustainable career path.
Is there a lot of room for cooperation with other countries?
Absolutely. I mean, as a national programme, we're supported by the United Kingdom Space Agency, by UK government, and a number of other entities from industry and academia. But we work internationally. We've had a number of experiments on the International Space Station, and critically for us, and what's really interesting, is the work that we've been doing with China. I'm one of the leaders of the UK's strategic programme of space science collaboration with China. About 4 years ago, China's government and China's National Space Administration were really interested in what we'd learnt in our methodologies for space education, began to partner with us, and we've seen a suite of activities now that's been growing and growing and growing in China. And we see that this focus on education can not only help try to meet our skills requirements, it can build platforms for greater collaboration, greater scientific research as well.
You talk about cooperation. In the race to space, you're talking about collaboration, cooperation, not competition?
In the end, you get a mixture of both. But what I'd like to point out is one of my favourite pictures that I use in my presentations. And it's a picture from 1997. And it's the US Space Shuttle Atlantis docking with the Soviet-era Mir space station. And that really was the beginning of the collaboration that led to the International Space Station. Now, wind back 10 years before that picture was taken to 1987. If you'd have told me when I was an undergraduate that I would see a US space shuttle docking with a Soviet-era space station, I'd have said that's impossible. So what's interesting in terms of competition and collaboration is that we're in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape, and there are new opportunities for collaboration. There will be competition, of course, and sometimes competition can be a great accelerator, but it's the collaborative framework of space science progress that we need to build on. And there is a lot more international collaboration than many people realise. So collaboration is the key for going forwards. And I think that the possibilities that we have from the discussion that I've been listening into, you know, I wouldn't say the sky is the limit, it's a bit of a cliche, but there is tremendous scope for the future and challenges as well.
Tremendous. That's all from this week's agenda. Next time, we'll have more of our best interviews as we talk debt, data, the global opioid epidemic, and as UK voters go to the polls for the third time in 4 years, we'll be finding out whether there's any such thing as a truly democratic electoral system. Don't forget, for more of the agenda, you can visit our website, or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team in London, it's goodbye.